Welcome everyone to the inaugural presentation of the Brookline League of Women Voters Conversation about Government. We invite you to join us as we explore local government in Massachusetts over the next year. We hope some of you here tonight will be inspired to join us on this journey. Tonight, Brookline's Town Administrator, Mel Kleckner, will be introducing us to forms of municipal government in the Commonwealth and answering your questions. Betsy DeWitt, President of the Brookline League of Women Voters and former Select Board Chair, will be our moderator this evening. Please write your questions in the chat, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Mel's presentation, Betsy will be reading questions to Mel. Thank you. Betsy?
Thank you, Shauna. The Brookline League of Women Voters has a long tradition of studying local issues. This coming October 20th, Wednesday, October 20th, we will hold the annual League of Women Voters of Brookline opening meeting and host a presentation on the history of Brookline government, which was incorporated in 1705 with local historians Ken Liss and Greer Hardwick. The event will be online. We live in unprecedented times. The Select Board, the Advisory Committee, town meeting members, members of countless town committees, and a seasoned group of town employees have steered Brookline successfully through 18 months of pandemic, and we are extremely grateful for their service. Tonight, one of our most experienced and valued town employees will be providing us with an overview of the types of local government we have here in Massachusetts. Mel Kleckner has been Brookline's town administrator for 11 years. He's also former president of the Massachusetts Municipal Association. Before Brookline, he was town manager for Winchester and town administrator in Belmont and Wilbraham. With this experience, he can report on models in other communities that function differently from Brookline. He'll give a presentation and then we'll take your questions. And I will remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat. The chat box is at the bottom of the screen and it says chat on it. Finally, at the end of the evening's question and answer period, we'll show you a way to contact our working group who will help us with planning for the next series of discussions going forward. And we look forward to hearing your comments. We hope that you will join our voter education events and give us feedback and use the email that will appear on the screen. And now we're going to hear from Mel Kleckner. Mel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Betsy, Shana, and very happy to be here with the League. Obviously very pleased that you spend a lot of time on voter education and good government activities, and that's why I'm in this business, and I know that's why you're active as well. So very, very, very pleased to be here tonight. So I did want to make a presentation on the form of local government. I really am not going to spend a lot of time on the process of how to change forms of government. There is a number of different and complicated processes that I'm sure you've heard before, and I understand you'll be evaluating later. So I'm really just going to talk about the actual forms and some of the changes that are involved in different forms of local government. So first thing I want to, okay, here we go. As Betsy mentioned, I've worked in 5 different communities. And by the way, this is my 40th year in the business, so it's hard to believe that it's that much time has gone by. But I started off in Arlington. And by the way, all of these towns are Massachusetts town forms of government. And but what I'm going to do is try to bring you through these and tell you that they're all very different, quite different, not only in the form of government and the options that they've chosen, but also in the title and roles of the town administration position, the executive position. So in Arlington, where I was the assistant town manager, it had a town manager form of government. I had strong executive authority, but it shared quite a bit of a significant responsibility with either select board or other elected boards. I took my first job as the administrator in Wilbraham, which is a bedroom community outside of Springfield. And that was interesting because it started off with the sort of the old version of the title of town administrator, which was executive secretary, which Brookline had many years ago as well. We changed that title, as most who had the title executive secretary did, to town administrator. But this was an interesting community because it was the only community I've worked in with an open town meeting. And it had a lot of decentralized elected authority. In that community, for example, the planning board was elected. I moved on to Belmont, which was my longest tenure position in my career. It was about 15 years. That was interesting. I also started off as the executive secretary, and we changed that title to town administrator, which more, I think, accurately reflects the level of that position. That was an interesting community because it had a three-member select board. And it was probably the one community where I had the least amount of executive authority on paper, but I had probably the most authority because it was delegated by the select board, at least for a period of time. Went off to Winchester, where I was the town manager and had very strong executive authority. But it was interesting that the charter there sets up the select board to have a veto over the town manager's authority there, which in many cases they do. But in this case, in Winchester, it almost set up the town manager and the select board to be a check on one another, as opposed to being working together as more of the combined executive authority of the town. And then finally to Brookline, which has very strong administrative authority, but limited executive authority. And what makes Brookline interesting, I think, is its active legislative body, our town meeting, which is no surprise to you all. So just interesting how all of these towns are town forms of government, each with a town meeting and a select board, but they were all very different. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go further. So I wanted to go over some essential concepts that are important to know in when you're looking at form of government in Massachusetts. First of all, local government are creatures of the state. The state controls, establishes local government, and there's really no way a local government can organize without state approval. However, Massachusetts has a constitutional provision around self-government and home rule, and it does allow cities and towns to organize its own government within some limits. But it always needs to go back to the state to get approval of any special kind of government authority. There are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and I believe that every single town, every single one of those 341 has some different variation. There is no two that are exactly alike. And that is because there's so many different options and variations within the couple of either the town or the city form of government. And I'll get into that a bit. What usually defines a municipal government is its charter. So a charter is an interesting concept. It's essentially the legislative act that authorizes the town to act in certain ways. Often that will be a very large document, maybe 25, 30, 50 pages, where it really lays out how all of the roles and responsibilities are in a town or city. Brookline does not have a single legislative act that constitutes a charter. We really have a combination of either default state laws that relate to local government organization, we adopt optional state laws, and then we enact our own home rule bills, which are state legislative acts. The Town Administrator Act of Brookline is one of those special legislative acts, but unlike a single legislative act, the Town Administrator Act is only 2 pages long. So there's a lot that's left to all of these other state laws and options that, since, as I heard, since 1705, it's really a patchwork of all these things that have happened over the ensuing 200 years, 300 years. Job titles. I've asked about this a lot. You know, what's the difference between a town manager, a town administrator, a city manager, city administrator, executive secretary, you name it. My answer is it depends. While it is true that town manager or city manager tends to have more executive authority, that's not always the case. So you really need to go beyond the titles and look to see what the charter describes for the administrator or the manager. I have been in positions where I've seen charters where a position called town administrator has much more roles and responsibilities and authority than a town manager. But so you have to look beyond that. I would say, generally speaking, when you see a position that's called town manager or city manager, it tends to have some executive authority that administrators do not, but that's not always the case. And I want to caution you about that. And also, a city or town, what really makes up a city or town? I've heard that question a lot is, what, you know, are we big enough to be a city? Are we too big to be a town? Form of government is the only distinction between a town and a city in Massachusetts. And I show you that Brookline, and now we're above with the 2020 census. We've moved beyond 60,000. We're at 63,191 population, and we're a town. Whereas in Palmer, outside in Western Mass, it only has 12,448 people, but it's a city. I don't know if it's the smallest city, probably not, but there are very small municipalities that are cities, very large ones that are towns. Both Brookline and Plymouth, for example, two of the largest populated towns are both town forms of government. And the names can be confusing. So when you see something that says the town of Watertown, it's actually a city, it's not a town. But because they were a town for many, many years, they chose to be called the town of Watertown. So right in their charter, it said it's a city form of government, but it wants to be known as the town of Watertown. So you can't always just look at the name of a town and decide whether it's a town or city form of government. Okay, now, so more on these variations. So as I said, there are towns and there are cities, and that's very clear, but then there are so many variations. I can't tell you how many different options there could be, or different ways a municipality can decide to self-govern and to create its own home rule. So even though we're all towns, you have different things, same with cities. Size of the governing bodies is a very big factor. On select boards, you can only be 3 or 5. You can't be 4, you can't be 7, you can't be 9. Select boards can only be 3 or 5, whereas town meeting and city councils can be different numbers. I know that the city of Cambridge has a city council that's 9 members, but the city of Newton has about 24. So there's a lot of different ways you can create the size of your governing bodies. The chief executive, whether it's a town or a city, it's always different. So for a city, you have to make a decision. Will you have an elected mayor or appointed manager? So you have either the strong mayor or the city management. What's the role of the city council? How does the city council, or in the case of the select board, when they have an administrator, what are those respective roles? Usually the major factors are appointing authority, who gets to hire and fire, who puts the budget together, who is able to make contracts and bind the town, and who represents the government at other levels of government, the media and others. Those tend to be those areas where, whether it's a town, the select board and the town manager, they have to figure out who does those. And in the city, same with the city council and the mayor or the city manager. On the legislative side, a town meeting is either you can go an open town meeting or a representative town meeting. Most of the communities that are fairly well developed in Eastern Mass are all representative forms of town meeting. Literally, if you've ever been to an open town meeting, any registered voter can go and vote. And so those aren't the kind of meetings that we have. Our town meetings are the same people who appear night after night to our town meetings. In an open town meeting session, what I find is they usually happen in one day because it's so hard to get everybody together. And what happens is certain groups will come to the meeting to deal with warrant articles that affect them. They'll leave, another group will come in. So it's very hard. The open town meeting is very hard to sort of have consistency. Whereas a representative, you have the same people at the same meetings, night in and night out. You're able to communicate with them by the listserv or other things. Policy involvement and use of committees. So on the city form, at least, and when you have a city council, you're more likely to have subcommittees or standing committees of the city council, whereas our town meeting, as you know, sometimes they create committees that the moderator will appoint, but they're really not under the control of the town meeting per se. Other governmental bodies and officials, every town has a different way of looking at different bodies. So as you know, in Brookline, our library trustees are elected, our town clerk is elected. In other communities, that's not the case. I mentioned before, in some communities, the planning board is elected. So you really have a lot of discretion as to how you want your government to operate and who has the authority and all that. So there are so many variations that are here. So I mentioned previously the Town Administrator Act. That was an act that was adopted in 1985, and it was last amended in 2010. Even though it only has 2 pages worth, and it doesn't talk about a lot of aspects of town government, it does have sort of the essential responsibility between the select board and the town administrator spelled out. And I'm taking this fairly verbatim, these 2 bullet points at the beginning. The town administrator is appointed by the select board and shall be subject to the authority and direction of the select board. So that's a pretty clear statement. The town administrator shall be the chief administrative officer of the town. And so when I see those words, and I knew those when I came to the town, it means that the executive authority is shared. In fact, in this case, the select board retains most of the executive authority in the community, at least on paper. So let me tell you a little bit about what the authority is that the town administrator is provided in the Town Administrator Act. So even though the select board appoints the department heads, the town administrator is actually given quite a bit of authority. The town administrator can submit, and I submit 1 name to the select board for their approval. So I go through the entire process. I'm going through the several department heads right now. And our Town Administrator Act says that the select board can only act upon the recommendation of the town administrator, and the town administrator may only give them one name of a candidate. And so I feel that's very strong. It's a very strong, even though it's not technically executive appointing authority, it really gives me as the town administrator the ability to give the select board 1 name. Effectively, it's the appointment. And of course, I spend a lot of time and work with the select board and make sure they're comfortable with that before I would bring them a name. But I find appointing authority, even though it's not clearly spelled out as a town administrator authority, there's a great deal of actual authority because of the nature of how the process works. The 2010 Act is right when I came to the town. That was the last provisions of the act. As you may remember, if you were around at that time, there was an effort for the town to consider strengthening the town administrators' roles. For the most part, the town meeting did not do that, although it did give the town administrator authority to appoint all other employees below the level of department head, except for elected bodies. So for example, nobody in the school department because they're under an elected school committee, and not any civil service employees. And the only civil service employees we have are police and fire. That's the only civil service employees. So the town administrators excluded from appointing or promoting members of the police and fire department. And that's a concern of mine, which I'll share. I do have a townwide budget preparation role. I do serve as a representative spokesperson for the town. These are all spelled out in the Town Administrator Act. And I have other duties and responsibilities as are delegated by the select board. So even though the Town Administrator Act is only 2 pages long, there's quite a bit there. I wanted to go over some of the towns and cities in our region, the ones that you're probably familiar with. Towns, and this means when you hear the word town in Massachusetts, that means they have to have a town meeting and a select board. Those are the two things that all towns have. And now most of these towns, in fact, all of them, have now a form of administration, whether it's a town manager or town administrator. All of these towns have some form of professional administrative position that shares administrative and executive authority with the select board. So those towns around here, Milton, Needham, Arlington, Dedham, Lexington. On the other hand, we have a lot of cities around us, and the defining situation with cities is none of them have town meetings or select board. They have a city council, almost in all cases. Now, you may have heard that Newton was called the Board of Aldermen for many years, and they have recently changed to the more generic city council. So I think actually all of these, maybe Somerville still has an alderman type of title, but all of these have city councils. And as I mentioned before, even Watertown, which is called the town of Watertown, is a city. So all those are cities around us. Did want to look at two in particular. So our neighbors, Newton and Cambridge. I know Cambridge is bordered by a big river, but I still consider them our neighbors. So on the one side, you have Newton, which has a very traditional mayor council form of government. You have the elected mayor with a 24-member council. On Cambridge's side, they don't elect, they have an appointed mayor, an appointed city manager. So it's called a council manager form of government. There are many cities in Massachusetts that have this. Worcester and Lowell and Cambridge are probably the biggest that you have. And I call them a hybrid because what many of these council manager forms do is they also have a mayor. It's a weak mayor, yet it's a mayor that has some political authority and a discretion. Now, as I understand in Cambridge, the mayor is appointed by or elected among the city council, as opposed to elected separately. And I think that's the case with most of the mayors, even in Worcester and Lowell. So you've got a very strong city manager with all the administrative and executive authority. Then you have a mayor who serves as a political official of the town. In the case of Cambridge, the weak mayor serves as both the chair of the city council and the school committee. Also serves as a ceremonial and leadership role. I find that interesting because in Brookline, as you know, we rely on the select board. I think there's a tradition of deferring to elected officials. And so, we might want to look at this hybrid as perhaps, if the town was not interested at some point to go to the traditional mayor role, this is potentially an option that I thought was interesting, that hybrid role. So with that, I think I'm going to spend the most of the next part of my presentation, or part of the time, just answering questions. And so happy to start that process now, Betsy.
Very good, and thank you for your good overview. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and then I've got a couple of my own. And I think I'm going to add a little bit. We have a question: what are the benefits and drawbacks of a town form of government having a charter? And I just want to say for the record that among our presentations during the year, we will undertake to discuss what is a charter, how is a charter. There's something called a charter commission, for which there is a documented process to create one, and we'll have a conversation explaining what is a charter. Having said that, do you see any issues around the fact that Brookline does not have a charter?
Yeah, I do. I think that it can be very difficult for many people to figure out who does what, because what a charter tends to, I find a charter does, is it puts all of the essential issues around governance in a single document. And that makes it easy for people to understand what the respective duties and roles are of these officials. If you wanted to ask a question about Brookline town government, for example, what are the duties and responsibilities of the Park and Recreation Commission? In fact, I was asked that the other day. And it took me literally days to figure this out. I mean, literally, because the town had taken action to create a park and recreation. Actually, they had a park commission and they had a recreation commission. Then they combined them. These are all acts of the legislature over the last 150 years. And you really have to be, and I'm not a lawyer, but you have to learn how to follow legislative acts and find out how, they've changed. So I think the charter, the probably the most essential part or the most important part is having it all in one place, rather than trying to find and having a lawyer try to figure, something out. And that's the case with Brookline. We have this just combination of all these things back from 1705. And the only thing that I think was a really effort at a charter is in 1985 when the Town Administrator Act was created.
Thank you. And I have a comment from one of our audience who says that Somerville changed its form to have a city council. So they must have done that during some period since you were doing your research. But I have a couple of questions that are actually generated a little bit from the current warrant articles coming up before November town meeting. And they're sort of examples, perhaps, of what has been the practice, is the practice, and I guess with lacking a charter may be the way. I don't know if we would do it differently with a charter. But we have two warrant articles that talk about modification of select board authority. One is to remove the police department from civil service, and the other one would delegate licensing authority. And I know that maybe Mel, you could explain what that might involve, but I do know that currently the select board does licensing from the one sort of common victualler license or a single alcoholic beverage license for a special event to licensing existing restaurants and other businesses in the town. And in addition, there are other examples of licensing that don't have anything to do with food service, for example. So if that were to be removed from the select board, where would it go and how would it get there?
Sure. The civil service issue is not really a charter issue per se. It's every city or town is given the ability, if they want to be in civil service or not, and you can go in and out, and it's a different process. But you're right, it is an essential part of the town's governance. The issue around the licensing is an interesting one. So as you know, the select board spends a lot of their times on Tuesday evenings, handling licensing of restaurants, and especially those with liquor sales, now marijuana sales, you name it. There's a lot of licensing responsibility that is on the select board's table. And at one point, our select board chair Hamilton said, is there a way we can do it better? Do we have to spend all the time at the meeting itself, or is there a way we can delegate some of the responsibility and perhaps approve them on a more expedited fashion? Well, come to find out, in the Town Administrator Act, even though it's only 2 pages, it does create some other aspects. And so there is a provision. I think I showed you earlier in the slide, there was a provision that said the select board may delegate other matters to the town administrator. And then there's a provision below that somewhere that says, but in no event shall the select board delegate its licensing authority for restaurants, liquor and all this stuff. So at one point, probably back in '85, there was someone who said, that's something we should not do. And so that's written in the law. And so what the select board are seeking is some relaxation of that provision. And so their first start is to eliminate that excluded or that explicit exclusion for delegating licenses. And then they're going to have to figure out how they really want to do it. And they haven't figured out that. They're going to take it 2 steps at a time.
But presumably going forward, it will require additional home rule legislation. Is that right?
Anything you want to change in the Town Administrator Act has to go back to the legislature, because that's who authorized it. And that's what I'm saying, the state has to approve all fundamental changes in the way a government operates. There was a question I wanted to mention.
Oh, sorry.
Well, there was a question about home rule. And so really what home rule is a concept, and the home rule essentially is the state government saying the cities and towns that exist in the state should have the ability to organize in the way that they want. We want them to have the ability to make decisions on their own, to have the kind of organization that is responsive to the issues that they have in their community. And so effectively, home rule is saying we will allow our cities and towns to organize in the way they want. And I kind of laugh at that a bit because I've been in this business a long time, and I know the state is very difficult. They really control local government. So you may know they control how many liquor licenses we can have, and they control who gets health insurance and who doesn't. So, there are so many things that there's mandates from the state, but by and large, they do allow us to create an organization that's responsive to our needs. So that's what I feel home rule is. We can petition the legislature directly to vary the way that our government operates.
And frankly, we do it in part, or we're capable of doing it in part through having a good working relationship with our state rep, Representative Vitolo in particular. But I guess what I'm saying is when you need to go to the legislature, it's useful to have a constructive relationship with your local representative.
There was a question, Betsy, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there's more questions.
Yeah. Let me ask. There's 2 that are connected. One talks about Brookline having many commissions and boards and volunteer government, and that is so true. It's really what makes Brookline the unique community that it is. Just having the direct involvement of our citizenry. Really not only just advising, but in many cases, they're on boards and committees that have legal import and effect. And the question, I think, is, would those go away in a city form? And then as a result of that, would the government become less connected to the residents that it has? And that's a really good question. My feeling is that when communities change their form of government, and by the way, I think I missed a really good slide, my last slide that I wanted to do. So why don't I get to that?
Go back to it, by all means.
Yeah, I'm
Share your
sorry,
screen.
I don't know what happened there. Yeah, all right. So this is the final slide that I wanted to show you. Who has moved from a town to a city recently? When I say recently, within the last 10 or so years, and why did they do it? And I think that will explain some of the concerns and reasons why cities and towns want to do this, or why towns want to do this. So most recently, the municipalities who've been a town and moved to a city form of government are Framingham, Amherst, Braintree, Weymouth, Randolph, and Winthrop. There were a lot of others. There's a lot more, especially in the central western part of the state, but those are the ones in Eastern Mass that come to mind. And, I think if you look at Amherst, I think you all would understand that Amherst is a community like Brookline, a very engaged community with a lot of professional people who really want to be involved in the government, but they changed their form of government to a city, and they chose to go with a city appointed city manager as opposed to a strong mayor, which, for example, Framingham decided to go to a strong mayor. But what I think all of these towns have in common are one of two things. They're seeking more accountability and effectiveness within a single executive authority. So there's some frustration with the multi-member board that serves as a multi-headed executive, and some of the process and politics and timing that go along with that. I mean, as an example, the select board cannot meet without posting a meeting 48 hours. Now, they do have some emergency authorization, but there are impediments with having a multi-member executive. And that's one of the reasons why I think municipalities go from a town to a city. Another reason is to make their legislature more effective and timely. So as you all know, we have a town meeting that meets annually in May. And then we're not required, but actually we might be required by bylaw to meet in the fall, when we typically meet in November. We can call other town meetings when necessary, but it takes time. It takes about, I would say, 4 to 6 weeks to really call and schedule a town meeting. And, with city councils, they're in session pretty much ongoing, constantly. They may be meeting every other week or thereabouts. And so when an issue comes up that requires town meeting approval, and for our, for cities and towns in Massachusetts, you need legislative approval for budgeting, appropriations. You need it for land transfers, zoning, bylaws, general bylaws. So there can be a lot of reasons why you need to meet fairly quickly or often as your legislative body. And I think many towns find that town meeting is not doing, is not the right mechanism. So that's why I find either one or both of those reasons. Now, what happens is, so are you then sacrificing effectiveness and accountability and timeliness for process and transparency? And that's a really good question. And really, I think that's an ultimate question for the town of Brookline to answer for themselves. I would suggest maybe we start talking to some of these communities who did it most recently and try to find out why it is that they decided to move to a different form of government. That was what I wanted to say. And when the question came up about losing committees and transparency and those kind of things.
We actually have already, sort of informally been, as we think about where we're going to go with the series of discussions about municipal government, have been discussing identifying communities whose experience, which we can ask them to share, and those who've gone through the charter reform process and changed, and some who've gone through it and haven't, are both examples that we've been thinking about asking. So we may consult back with you about that. But the idea was to get somebody who can say, this is how it worked wherever that example is. And, these are the concerns that people had, and this is what the result was. We now have some additional questions and comments. Concern about Cambridge's Plan E style of government with a powerful city manager is that often the city councilors are unable to compel the manager to implement policies the city council supports. Curious to know if you share that concern or have any other thoughts about the city manager city council dynamic in that model.
Sure. Well, I can honestly say I've never worked in the city council manager form of government, but not only was I MMA president, but I was also vice president in the International City County Management Association, which is my professional association. So I spent a lot of time talking to managers who work under the council manager form. In fact, that's the most prevalent. When I talk about select boards and town meetings with my colleagues in other parts of the country, they just look at me like I have 3 heads, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. New England is the only place in the country that has town meetings. I believe it's true. I grew up in Connecticut. They still have some there. For the most part, Connecticut has converted, at least the more populous towns have converted to council forms of government, some with mayors, some with managers. But in other parts of the country, there is no such thing as town meeting. So I'm pretty familiar with the council manager form. You know, the council appoints the manager. If the city council doesn't hold the manager accountable, then get rid of the city council. You know, it's really as simple as that. So that's really what I would have to say. You know, the city council has to develop mechanisms to evaluate and evaluate the performance of the city manager, goals and objectives, and things like that. So, you know, some do it well. You know, I know Cambridge has this reputation for the managers having quite a bit of authority. I knew Bob Healy. I know Bob is, you know, very strong manager. Been there a long time, probably outlasted every city council member who was ever there during his tenure. And so, you know, there are other factors that make up, you know, a powerful city manager. But in terms of the control, it is clearly the city council who controls the manager. And I've seen it many, many times where managers are asked to leave, fired, move on, because the council doesn't feel that the manager is effectively representing their goals and objectives and their policies.
I think you've already asked this question, answered this question, but I'm just going to put it out there to see if there's anything else. The question is, would you talk about city managers and how to make sure the city manager does what is requested? And I guess I'm going to say, shifting from what you've just been saying, are there other ways to evaluate the manager's responsiveness and the way the government works under the city manager?
Yeah, of course, there's many different performance evaluation mechanisms that can be used. You know, I think there's two things that come here. Number one are policies, and there's no question that every city manager, certainly the ones that belong to the professional association I mentioned, we have a code of ethics, and our code of ethics accepts that the elected officials set the policy in our communities. And if we're not happy with that, we shouldn't be working in those communities. I think what happens a lot is, you know, where policy and administration get sort of overlapped. And so maybe the city council isn't happy with a department head that the city manager hired, or you know, some sort of administrative policy that they create. And that's difficult because the charter says it's the city manager that manages and has administration of the city. And sometimes those conflicts arise when the city council, they're not really policy issues. They're just not happy with the kind of administrative decisions and judgment that the manager is making. Those are more difficult, frankly.
So maybe what you're saying is you have to be thoughtful as to how you set it up, in part, or structure it, so to speak.
Yeah, you know, typically what happens, I believe there's a subcommittee of the council, and it might be a city manager performance subcommittee, or, you know, town manager or city manager relations subcommittee, or whatever. And they're the ones who are creating these systems for the city council to implement. But you know, it's been my experience that city managers have a shorter tenure than Cambridge. And you know, I think there has been some certainly long tenured people in Cambridge, and you know, we could talk about Cambridge, but I'm not going to do that anymore.
Anyway, all right, we have one more. Is there another way other than creating a charter to organize the approximately 300 years of policy that regulate Brookline now? Is there some kind of modification or reform that might make a difference or make changes?
I think there is better ways to organize it, but I will tell you that I've spent my entire 11 years keeping notebooks and copies of things that I find along the way. Oh, I didn't know the town had a law in 1931 that did this, a special act of the legislature that did that. I had no idea. How does that, how does that, square with the Town Administrator Act that was done in 1985? So it's very difficult. And I would say that that is a real problem for me, is not having one place where I can find out, where all the responsibilities and roles of the government are. So I don't think that there's any other way other than, you could call it a charter. To me is the same as a legislative act, a very comprehensive legislative act. So no, I don't really think there's any other ways other than trying to organize it. For 300 years worth, I don't think it's a very practical situation. For example, I believe the town clerk, at least for a while, had been documenting every single special act that was the town adopted from 1705. It's 20, 30 pages long. It's just too much.
Well, having said that, I guess I have another question for you. In city forms of government, what are typical pathways for non-governmental volunteer issue-focused groups to engage with the city council? Do you have thoughts on that one?
Again, I've not worked in a form of government, but I believe they have a similar procedures that our select board has. They have open public comment periods. They have subcommittees where, for example, I see gun safety might be an issue. I wouldn't be surprised if the city council in Cambridge has a subcommittee of its council dealing with gun safety, and they'll have meetings and engage the public. It would be different for sure, I think, than the way that we do it now. I assume that there's similar procedures to petition matters before the city council. So as you all know, our town meeting is very popular for having policy referendum or some other policy issues that are created as resolutions. I assume that there's similar type of petitions process. It's not town meeting, but the city council does meet throughout the year. And I believe I've attended a few city council meetings in my day, and they have a robust public comment and participation process for sure, I believe.
Okay, then an interesting follow-up to that is that given Brookline has at least more than 240 town meeting members, do towns have other legislative bodies that are equally, in other words, is town meeting in Brookline with its 240 comparable, similar, larger, smaller, and would a smaller town meeting be possible, and might it operate more efficiently?
That's a great question. I see it's Rob. Hi, Rob. I think that I think it's typical. I think that town meetings are very large bodies. I believe when the representative form of town meeting was allowed, there were rules around it in terms of how many voting precincts there were and how many people had to be in town meeting. So typically I find town meeting has about that many persons. So I do think there's something about it that we would be limited to make it much smaller, but that's a good question. I don't know that answer. I think that's a good question that we should pursue.
Well, I will say it will be discussed coming forward because we must go through a re-precincting process. And as I understand it, the standard that you were referring to that says that a precinct shall have, and it's up to X number of bodies in it, or I guess it's registered voters, then the re-precincting process will definitely raise some of these questions as to whether or not our precincts are the right size, whether or not there should be the same number of town meeting members coming from each precinct. Now, I don't think that's going to get the depth of discussion because I know that the re-precincting process is going to be unbelievably, it's been squeezed into what, I don't know, 6 weeks or something ridiculous like that. But still, the discussion certainly, it will generate questions and discussion, I'm sure. Just the question of re-precincting.
Yeah, how many, so how many members per precinct do we have currently?
15.
15. Could that be some other number like, division divided by 3? Because, you have terms of town meeting members are 3 years, and you want those to
Yeah.
to go each year an equal number. So you could do, could you do 9 or 12?
12, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Anyway,
know.
I'm guessing there won't be time for that level of a conversation because the re-precincting has to be accomplished. I can't remember the date, but it's like the end of October, which is not easy to do. But it certainly is a subject worth further discussion, and maybe we'll put it into our list of items coming forward. That is the last question in our chat. And I'm just going to say thank you so much, Mel. This has been, I think, very helpful for folks. I suspect it's generating a number of questions that will come forward later and which we as the league will continue to try to address. If you happen to see the screen that's up now, you'll see that we have a group of league people who are going to be designing the number of comment, going to be putting together the package of discussions that we'll have going forward. And there's an email whereby you can reach them. It's called lwvbconversations@gmail. So I just want everybody to be aware of that as a way of giving feedback and maybe saying, gee, we'd really like to have more information about, and then we'll see what we can do about it. And I think someone else has dropped in a comment, which is, oh, okay, redistricting has to be filed by December 14th. Okay, that's the window that we have, which is, again, considerably less than the last time, which I participated in a decade ago. So I think with that, I want to say thanks, Mel. This has been very helpful. It's a good start. I don't think we are clear yet about where we're going to end with this, but we will certainly be discussing it at great length going forward. And just to remind everybody, on October 20th, we will have a presentation which will help us at least understand the origins of Brookline's representative town government and where that history begins. We've now got a little bit of a modern sort of reflection about that. And we have clearly much more going forward in the way of conversations and questions that will be raised and answered. But thank you, Mel. This has been very, very helpful, and we really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure. And if there are questions that come up, we feed them to Ernie or Betsy, and I'll make sure I respond to
Right.
them.
We'll certainly funnel things toward you as they arise, and we may consult with you as we go forward as we formulate the next series of discussions. But anyway, thank you very much. And thank you all who have participated. And thanks to the league team who helped to put this together. You've done a great job. It's very well organized. And I'm hoping that we will be able to do an equally well organized series of discussions going forward. So thanks to all, and we'll see you soon.